Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC. And today, we're covering a book that I thought I'd be covering in a much different time. Well, I guess a different time is accurate, but definitely in a different way. I thought I'd be covering this on a series called Count the Classics, but then it turned out I never ended up actually doing anything with that, for better or worse. Even so, I figured it was time to actually circle back around and give a dedicated album review, book review. I've been doing album review stuff the last couple days, so that's why it's on my brain. Book review for Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I read this book way back in October of 2022, so it's been 2.5 years since I actually got through it. So now that I'm finally reviewing it, I would, ask you to forgive me if this review ends up being relatively mediocre compared to some of my more timely reviews, because I'm just kind of catching up on a bunch of old stuff. And because it's been a long time since I read the book at this point. Rebecca is a book I still strongly recall my mixed feelings about, but some of the details of some of that are a little bit tougher to actually parse out. At the time that I actually read this book, I felt arguably the most conflicted that I had about basically any book I had ever read up to that point, with maybe the only real exception being The Bird Book, or The Obscene Bird of Night by Jose Donoso. But with all that being said, let's actually talk about Rebecca and start off with the good, because, even though it was a supremely mixed bag for me in the end, there were a couple things that I did enjoy about it, most notably being the twist and the final third of the book. And I'm sorry to kind of, spoil the book to a certain degree by saying that there's a pretty big twist in the book, but I would be remiss to not mention it because it was the part of the book that actually got me hooked, and that's kind of disturbing considering that the twist doesn't happen until about 2/3 of the way through, but that final third of the book is just spectacular. Like I said, about 2/3 of the way in, a pretty major reveal occurs, that the build-up immediately prior to it is very effective, very engaging as well. The twist is also very shocking. It didn't feel cheap to me. It felt very rewarding, in fact, actually, to have read through those first 2/3 of the book to actually get to that twist. And the reveal itself and the ramifications of those, the consequences of the revelation, are pretty perfectly executed. The final third of the book as a whole was really, really enjoyable for me. If you enjoy that sort of subtle mystery aspect overall, that kind of the first 2/3 is more or less working to build up and actually give you, I suspect that this book will definitely be a click for you. I didn't really clue into that aspect for a while on my reading, however, kind of exacerbated by my problems with it, most notably boredom. But that final third of the book, the twist and everything, actually incredible, very, very, very good stuff. However, I did mention boredom, and that's where we're going to, shift pretty early on in this video to the bad of Rebecca, at least in my experience reading it, is that of my edition, 230 pages of the total 380 pages were not that good at all, in my opinion. If you enjoy the particular characters and the tone, the style and the prose of this book, I think you'll be fine with it. I think you'll really click with it. I know a bunch of people who really love Rebecca because of the tone, because of the prose, because of the style that it is written, because of the way that comes off. I didn't particularly click with this myself, so I kind of had a hard time getting through the book. I was rather unfathomably bored through the majority of it. Like I said, about 2/3 of the way through was when a twist occurs, and that's when I got really engaged in it. Everything before that, I was just excessively bored. In addition to, the boredom that I felt in the first 2/3, I would say the very beginning of the book, the first few chapters of it, are really confusing in a way that I personally didn't find rather effective. I would say this definitely set me off personally on the wrong foot with the book. And I also hear that it's pretty intentional, and it does come full circle in the end. When you finish the book, you kind of understand why Daphne du Maurier started the book the way that she did. But just starting off myself, I don't really agree that it actually works in this context. Part of the reason why the beginning of the book was confusing for me is because, well, you kind of expect to get an idea of who you're actually following in the book, And although you get an idea of who the narrator as a character is, you actually never learn the name of the protagonist of Rebecca. So you end up in a case of like forever kind of waiting for to just kind of learn what's going on, like where you're at, and it takes a long time to build up any of that information, and much of it kind of comes indirectly rather than directly, and it definitely doesn't come quickly, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I just didn't really enjoy it personally for this book. I was also kind of sold on Rebecca as being a sort of spooky season type of read, but it's not really that. I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier in the good section that there's a sort of indirect mystery aspect to Rebecca instead of it being spooky, and that is basically the case. I'd also say that Rebecca is a lot more drama than it is anything spooky season related. Not necessarily that a book has to be scary to be, spooky season related. This is definitely not scary, but even the general tone and everything of the book don't really fit that vibe the way that I was basically expecting for it to, and that also kind of ended up not really working for me in the long run because I was expecting something totally different than what this was. So, I just didn't get what I wanted from Rebecca. I obviously sound pretty critical of the book overall, and I somewhat apologize for that. I know there are a lot of big fans of this novel. It just definitely wasn't my thing. I would say Rebecca is a case of something not being for me. Moving into the ugly, I'll go ahead and say that I find it very funny that the kind of tagline, at least with my edition, is the unsurpassed modern masterpiece of romantic suspense. And now I disagree almost entirely on basically every facet of that description, actually. So first of all, the romance arc is actually kind of weird in this book. It's even uncomfortable, and obviously, like, there's kind of a point to that. There's a lot of questions to be had about character motivations, and you're exploring that. That's a lot of what the more compelling side of the story is about, and definitely where the twist and final third of the book end up being so good is the way that it actually handles those topics when things kind of hit the fan. But most of the book basically got a squinty-eyed, like, question mark expression kind of going on in there, where I just wasn't fully following along with everything, especially in the romance side of things. I was just like, this isn't a romance. Like, it is, but it's not. And if you go into it expecting it to be a romance, at least the way that most people probably think of that term in a genre sense anymore, it's not that. It's definitely not going to be that. So even on the romance side of things, I found my expectations kind of subverted. Maybe not necessarily intentionally subverted, but they were subverted nonetheless, and I wasn't a particularly big fan of that. I also wouldn't call Rebecca very suspenseful, all in all. I just found it plain boring throughout the most of it. It took me knowing that a crazy twist happens in the book to get me to not DNF it, basically. This would have been like my effective first DNF, or at least my first outright DNF at the time that I was reading it, if I had not known that there is a twist. That's part of the reason why I say in the good that, like, I'm sorry for spoiling that, but there's a reason why I spoiled that. It's because I knew that there was going to be something that happened, and trying to push through the material that I really did not enjoy for the first 2/3 of the book to get to that point is the only reason that I ever ended up finishing the book. If I didn't know about that, I would have DNF'd because I simply didn't find most of the material compelling. And I know that most of that is a me thing, and most of it just wasn't suited to my tastes, so it didn't work for me problem all around, but that was my experience with Rebecca. So when it comes down to the recommendation, well, the recommendation comes in one of two different ways. Obviously, the first recommendation point is that I don't actually recommend Rebecca for pretty obvious reasons. The slow burn aspect to it, the first 2/3 until you actually get to that twist, is just a bit too slow. It's too boring, it's too plotting, and doesn't actually really do anything that I personally found super engaging. While the ending is really, really great, I just didn't enjoy the first 2/3 of it enough to say solidly that that ending was worth it. I really enjoyed that twist and ending, but it wasn't necessarily worth the amount of hours that I put into reading the first 2/3 of it when I was so bored with it. The second aspect to this recommendation is that the last third is indeed really, really fantastic. And I think that if you give this a shot, and if you click with it in the first, I don't know, say 50 to 75 pages, it'll be a slam dunk book for you. But if you're getting like 100, 150 pages in and it's still doing nothing for you, I can't guarantee that the final third will change your mind. It almost changed my mind, but it's just too long. I think if the book was like 100 pages shorter, 75 pages shorter at least, but you kept the last, say, 150, 125 pages basically the same, you would end up with a much more enjoyable experience because you're not having to push through so much, in my opinion, drudgery just to get to what ended up actually being really good. So those are my thoughts on Rebecca, a little bit of a shorter review as I catch up on reviewing a book that I haven't read for, a few years at this point. I appreciate you watching this video if you did, and I'm sorry if this is a book that you really love. If this is a book you really love, I actually would like for you to comment below. Tell me like some of the reasons why it worked for you, why it clicked for you, what you actually enjoy about Rebecca, what it is about those elements that actually put those pieces together for you, because for some reason this one just didn't really click into place for me, and I kind of don't like the fact that it didn't. It's one of those books that like a lot of people talk about, a lot of people know about, a lot of people rave about who have read it, but like I don't really get it myself, and I would like to. I would like to know a little bit more why you liked it, so if you did enjoy it, comment down below. But either way, thank you for watching this review. For now, I have been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video, assuming this review didn't completely turn you off of the channel.